Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling some really difficult source material. Our mission is to unpack the evidence, specifically looking at the patterns of coercive control that really set the stage for a horrific crime in Scotland. We want to trace how things escalated and how the cover-up happened right after. We're focusing on the death of Phoenix Spencer Horne.
And to really understand this, we have to start with Phoenix herself, Fee, as she was known. She was just 21. The sources paint a picture of someone incredibly vibrant, really generous. She had this knack for helping people. There's an example mentioned, supporting Miss Scotland finalist Grace McCabe through tough times. It's that sad irony, isn't it? Someone so good at seeing others' struggles couldn't see the danger in her own relationship.
That danger being Euan Methan. He was 27, her boyfriend for about 2 years. And on the surface, he looked perfect. Royal Mail postman, seemed polite, respectful. Phoenix's family, especially her mom, Alison Spencer, completely welcomed him. They trusted him. Alison even texted with him regularly. So you have this stark contrast. The public image versus the hidden reality. Zero signs outwardly of what was really going on.
Exactly. And that's the core of the betrayal the family talks about in the sources. It's unimaginable pain. Alison Spencer spoke about, loving and supporting your daughter for years, only to find out the person you let into your home was, tearing her down from the inside. It really frames everything we're talking about today, the pain, the legacy.
Okay, so let's get into the main mechanism here. Coercive control. It's central to the sources, but it's a term that can be a bit misunderstood. We're not just talking about arguments or jealousy. It's a specific pattern designed to make someone dependent, to undermine them.
Yes, exactly. It's fundamentally about stripping away someone's autonomy, their independence. And it's crucial to get that this often isn't about big, loud fights or immediate violence, not at first anyway. It's usually way more subtle, chronic, calculated. In Phoenix's case, the sources suggest the shift really started picking up in 2024. And it began, interestingly, around her job, her independence. She was waitressing at the Strathaven Hotel.
Right, the sources mentioned Euan getting frustrated about her working evenings, weekends. But the way he expressed it, it wasn't a direct order, was it? He didn't say, quit your job.
No, and that's precisely what makes this kind of control so insidious. He didn't command. He weaponized his own vulnerability. He framed his complaints not as him being controlling, but as him suffering. He'd say things like he felt lonely, or that her ambition was making him feel insecure. And because Phoenix was naturally empathetic, naturally caring, well, it worked straight away.
So she ends up feeling guilty for just living her life, having a job.
Exactly that. She was essentially conditioned to feel responsible for his emotional state, putting his feelings above her own goals. So what happens? She starts apologizing, she starts changing her schedule, adjusting her life, not out of physical fear initially, but because she felt this psychological pressure to fix his manufactured distress. Her focus shifted from her own life, her career, to just managing his emotions.
And I imagine this pattern didn't just stop at her job schedule, right? Coercive control tends to spread, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What else did the sources show about how her world was shrinking?
Yeah, you see clear signs of isolation creeping in. That's a classic hallmark. So while he's keeping up this polite act for the family, Phoenix herself was quietly giving up hobbies. She was spending less time with friends. Why? To be available for him, to soothe his loneliness. And this is so important. The control was disguised. It looked like intense love, deep concern. The family saw a couple that seemed really close, really attached. They didn't see how could they. That one person was systematically cutting off the other support system. She was giving up her independence bit by bit, all framed as devotion. And because he was so plausible, so polite, nobody questioned it.
Okay, let's shift to the final day, Saturday, November 16th, 2024. This day is critical because it really shows that path from the slow control to the final awful violence. They both worked that day, just a normal Saturday routine. Phoenix at the hotel, Euan on his postal route.
And the sources point to a key interaction that afternoon. While Phoenix is at work, Euan texts her, and it's the same theme again, complaining about her hours, about him being lonely. And Phoenix, true to the pattern they'd established, replies with an apology, taking responsibility again for how he feels. The sources suggest this exchange might have been the final trigger where all that built-up resentment finally boiled over.
Then we move into the evening, the timeline of the murder itself. Phoenix texts her mom around 9:37 p.m., just saying they're home, having takeaway. But there's a really crucial piece of testimony here, isn't there? Something that blows apart Euan's later claims.
Yes, the delivery driver. This is key. The driver dropped off their food earlier, maybe around 8 p.m., and later testified that Euan seemed completely normal. Not drunk, not high, not agitated. Nothing like the psychotic break he'd later try to claim. So this suggests the violence that happened later around midnight wasn't some sudden snap. It followed this pattern.
And then, around midnight, the neighbors downstairs hear something. A loud noise, then hurried footsteps, more activity. Which lines up with the forensic data from Euan's phone too, right? A spike in movement shown on his activity app around that time.
It does. And the attack itself, the details are brutal and they speak volumes. It suggests intense, focused rage, not just some impulsive act. The pathologist found Phoenix was attacked with 3 different knives. 3. She had 20 stab wounds. 10 of those were on her face. That level of violence, particularly facial injuries, often points towards an attempt to dehumanize or destroy identity. She was also strangled by hand. The fatal injury was a deep stab wound to the chest.
The sources also mentioned the violence wasn't static. It moved through the flat evidence found in the bathroom, the hallway, a knife in the bedroom.
Right, which paints this terrible picture of Phoenix trying to get away, fighting for her life. It wasn't confined to one spot. It was a sustained, violent pursuit. It confirms she was conscious, she was resisting.
Okay, let's move into the next 48 hours, because this is where the calculation, the coldness really comes through. After the murder, Euan immediately shifted into, well, damage control.
Yeah.
Trying to cover it up, destroy evidence.
Yeah, it's a period of just chillingly cold calculation. Right after killing her, he takes the knives used in the attack, and he attempts to mutilate her body. He decapitated her and tried to dismember her further. The sources mentioned attempts to sever her torso, her right wrist, her ankle. This wasn't just about hiding the body. It feels like an attempt to obliterate, perhaps make identification harder or disposal easier. Her body was eventually found hidden under a towel in the hallway.
And it's just, the juxtaposition is staggering. He's doing that, and then just hours later, what's he doing? At 2:40 a.m., he's messaging drug dealers trying to buy cocaine, and the next day, Sunday, the sources say he accessed websites 170 times. Over like 10 hours, what was he looking at? Yes, that intense online activity from about 8 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. on the Sunday. The specific searches weren't detailed in the public sources we have, but the sheer volume and the timing, combined with the messaging dealers, it just completely shreds any claim he was out of it or not in control. He was functioning. He was rational enough to use his phone, seek drugs, browse the web extensively. Maybe he was researching what to do next, or maybe just desperately trying to distract himself with the horrific reality just feet away. We don't know for sure what he searched.
And all while this is happening, he's actively deceiving Phoenix's mother, Allison, using her own phone against her, basically.
It's cruel. It really elevates it beyond just a cover-up. He knew Allison expected regular texts from Phoenix, so he took over that communication. He impersonated Phoenix to keep her mom from suspecting anything was wrong, to buy himself time.
The specific texts are just devastating. Allison gets messages like, hey, Fee isn't up yet. I'll get her to text you when she is X. And later, hey, sorry, I've just woken up XX, using the X for kisses. Allison would have seen that familiar tone, that X, and felt reassured. It's sickening how effective it was because it felt so normal to her.
He weaponized their familiarity, their intimacy. All weekend, he's driving around in Phoenix's car, apparently still trying to score drugs. All while sending these texts, keeping up the fiction that Phoenix was just sleeping in, maybe a bit hungover.
But the whole thing falls apart on Monday, November 18th. Phoenix was known to be reliable, very reliable. So when she doesn't show up for her shift at the Strathaven, her colleagues knew instantly something was seriously wrong. That's when the alarm was raised.
Exactly. And only then, when he must have realized the game was up, did Euan finally call 999 around midday on Monday. But even in that call, that supposed confession, he's still spinning a story, trying to control the narrative. He says, I had a psychotic break and killed my wife. He tries to suggest it was accidental, like they were just messing about. He blames drugs, cocaine, steroids, claims he was out my face.
But all the evidence just contradicted that, didn't it? The delivery driver saw him acting normally just hours before, and his phone activity showed he was lucid, making calls, searching the web after the murder, not the actions of someone in a blackout.
Absolutely. And then there was his own statement to the police when they arrested him. That really sealed it. He said something like, I could not stay here with her, like that I tried to dismember her, I moved her from the bath and put her there. That clearly shows awareness. He knew what he'd done, he knew where she was, and he admitted trying to dispose of the evidence. It completely undermined the psychotic break defense.
In the end, Euan Methan was sentenced to life. Minimum of 23 years before he's eligible for parole, meaning he'll be 50. The judge, Lord Matthews, noted Euan sent a letter saying he was remorseful, but it answered none of the family's questions about why. The court had concluded the violence stemmed from that buildup of control and resentment, not drugs.
Yeah, and if you trace it all back, that slow, steady erosion of Phoenix's life, using that weaponized vulnerability, it was all leading up to this. It seems the need for her complete submission eventually morphed into the need for her complete silence.
And that really is the core lesson, isn't
Yeah.
it? What we need you, the listener, to take away from these sources. The real danger often isn't just the final explosion of violence, it's the buildup, that gradual, quiet undermining of someone's self, often disguised as love, as need, as vulnerability.
But Phoenix's story doesn't end entirely in tragedy. Her legacy is now about action. Her family took their grief and channeled it. They raised thousands through fundraising, donating it to women's aid services across Scotland. Women's Aid Glasgow put it powerfully, saying, "Her name, Phoenix, now stands for more than loss. It stands for action, for change, for refusing to let her story end in silence. This is what it means to rise from the ashes." So her story is now helping protect others. It's an active legacy.
It really is. This deep dive just underscores that terrifying reality. Control can hide in plain sight. It can fool everyone, even those closest. The horror wasn't only the final act, horrific as it was, but that systematic dismantling of her independence that came before it. So here's something for you to think about. If control can hide so well behind the mask of intense emotional need, what signs of vulnerability being weaponized are we perhaps overlooking? In our own lives, in the relationships around us, what are we conditioned maybe to not see? We'll leave you with that thought.
Welcome to The Explainer. You know, most of the time, these stories start with a crime being discovered. But the case of Phoenix Spencer Horn, well, it's different. It's a tragic story that began not with a discovery, but with a confession. And it really forces us to look at the hidden, subtle signs of control and the absolutely devastating places they can lead.
So, like I said, this story doesn't kick off with a missing persons report or a frantic search. No, it begins with a shocking phone call to the police, a confession that seemed to come out of thin air, a full 2 days after the crime was committed.
So there he was on a Monday, midday. 27-year-old Euan Methan makes this call, and just like that, a 48-hour period of really calculated deception comes to an end. But that phrase he used, psychotic break, well, as we're about to see, it would unravel pretty quickly and reveal something much, much colder.
It just begs the question, right? How does a relationship that looks so perfect to everyone on the outside end up in such a brutal, violent act? To even begin to get our heads around that, we have to go back. We need to look at the life Phoenix was building for herself and the man her family thought they knew. Because that disconnect, that gap between the public face and the private reality, that's really at the heart of this whole story.
All right, so let's dig into how this all got started. And, you know, this wasn't some whirlwind romance that just burned out in a tragic way. No, this was a long-term relationship, one that, from the outside, seemed to be built on a solid foundation of love and trust.
Phoenix herself, she was just 21. A really vibrant, kind person. I mean, her name, Phoenix, it just perfectly matched her spirit, right? People knew her as Fee, and she was this person who was always lifting others up, juggling multiple jobs, and just being that rock, that constant support for her friends. Her life was really, truly just getting started.
And for 2 years, Euan Methan, who was a postman, was right there by her side. He was so integrated into her family, they basically saw him as an adopted son. He was polite, he was affectionate, he was seen as totally trustworthy. But what they didn't know, what nobody knew, was that this was all a carefully built facade. And behind it was a much darker, much more sinister reality that Phoenix was living with every single day.
Okay, so here's the really crucial part we need to understand. How does a seemingly loving relationship turn into one of pure control? It's not like a switch was flipped. It didn't happen overnight with some big aggressive act. It was a slow, creeping, really insidious process.
You see, it all started really subtly. It wasn't about him making these big demands. It was about complaints. Complaints that were disguised as love, as concern. Euan would start talking about how frustrated and lonely he felt whenever Phoenix had to work her evening shifts at the restaurant. Now, to an outsider, you might just think, oh, that's just a boyfriend who misses his girlfriend. But it wasn't. It was the beginning of a pattern of coercive control.
In the cycle, it just kept repeating. Euan would complain, and Phoenix, because she was such a caring person, would actually apologize for his feelings and then try to change her plans to accommodate him. Over and over, this cycle conditioned her to feel guilty. Guilty for her own independence, for her own ambition. It was slowly, piece by piece, chipping away at her autonomy, probably without her even fully realizing what was happening.
All right, now let's get into the timeline of those horrifying 48 hours. This wasn't some random, sudden explosion of violence. No, this was the absolute culmination of that escalating control we've been talking about.
So on that final Saturday, that awful cycle repeated itself one last time. He sends her a text while she's at work, complaining again about being lonely. She apologizes. She comes home. At 9:37 in the evening, she sends a text to her mom saying everything's fine, they're just having dinner. And then, just a few hours later, around midnight, neighbors hear it. A loud noise, hurried footsteps, the sounds of a struggle, the sounds of Phoenix fighting for her life.
The attack that followed was just absolutely savage. Phoenix was strangled and stabbed 20 times, with 3 different knives. And the concentration of the wounds on her face, well, it suggests a deeply personal and just brutal assault.
But the horror, it didn't stop there. It didn't end with her death. For the next 48 hours, while Phoenix's family had no idea, while they thought she was perfectly safe, Euan Methan was orchestrating a chillingly calculated and unbelievably cruel cover-up.
He then decapitated her and tried to dismember her body, hiding it under a towel in their hallway. The prosecutors later called it exactly what it was, a clear attempt to defeat the ends of justice. I mean, let's be real, this is not the action of someone having a momentary psychotic break. This is a cold, methodical effort to conceal a horrific crime.
And get this, while Phoenix's body was lying just a few feet away, Euan's activity was chillingly normal. The very next day, he's on the internet, accessing websites 170 times. He's messaging drug dealers. He was just living his life in the exact same space where he had just taken hers. It's such a stark indicator of his complete detachment from the horrific thing he'd just done.
But maybe the cruelest, most heartless part of this whole deception was that he started using Phoenix's own phone. He picked it up and began texting her mother, Allison, pretending to be Phoenix, all just to buy himself more time and keep up this awful illusion that everything was fine. And this right here, this just completely blows his whole psychotic break claim out of the water. He didn't just send a text, he perfectly mimicked her texting style right down to the little affectionate X's she always used. These are the lucid, calculated actions of a man who is fully in control, not someone who's lost in psychosis. No way.
So how did this whole web of lies finally come crashing down? Because, a deception this elaborate, you can't keep it up forever. Especially not when the person you're pretending to be, Phoenix, was known for being so incredibly reliable. Well, it all fell apart on that Monday morning. Phoenix didn't show up for work, and he knew questions were about to be asked, so that's when he made that 999 call. But every single piece of evidence, from the takeaway driver who said he seemed completely normal that night, to his own phone's activity tracker, it all contradicted his story. The evidence wasn't pointing to a man who lost his mind. It was pointing to a cold, methodical killer.
So on July 14th, 2025, the verdict came down. Judge Lord Matthews sentenced Euan Methan to life in prison. The minimum term he has to serve is 23 years. The judge even pointed out that a so-called letter of remorse from Methan answered none of the agonizing questions Phoenix's family had. And just think about it, he could be eligible for parole when he's only 50 years old.
But this story, it really doesn't end with a prison sentence. Because in the face of this just unimaginable loss, Phoenix's family, they chose to channel their grief into action. They took the thousands of pounds raised in a fundraiser and donated it to women's aid services all across Scotland, specifically to help other people escape the exact same situation that took Phoenix's life.
And with that choice, her family made sure her name, Phoenix, would stand for something more. It would become a symbol of hope and of action. They ensured her spirit would live on, not just as a victim, but as a real force for change, a legacy that will help protect other women from a similar fate.
So this case really leaves us with a difficult but incredibly important question, doesn't it? The signs were there. They were subtle, yes, and they were disguised as love and concern, but they were there. Honoring Phoenix's legacy, I think, means we all have to learn to see past that facade. We have to get better at recognizing those quiet, subtle patterns of control and find the courage to speak up before it's too late.